Welcome to Greenwich and the Environment. I'm Diva Wareing, your host, ready to take you on a journey through the heart of creativity, culture, research and sustainability at Greenwich. So, whether you're passionate about the planet or just curious about the hidden forces shaping our world, stick around. This is where sustainability meets creativity. Let's get started. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. There's pollution in the seas and we're still trying to solve climate change. Our current global systems are not working for our planet or our communities. So, the question is, can social innovation drive the change we desperately need? With me in the studio today is Dr Emilio Costales. Emilio is a senior lecturer in Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the Executive Business Centre at the University of Greenwich. He is also the author of the book Social Entrepreneurship and Grand Challenges, Navigating Layers of Disruption from COVID-19 and Beyond. Before coming to the United Kingdom, he taught financial literacy in New York City. He has worked extensively with local NGOs and volunteering organisations as a member of the Politics, Development and Sustainability Group. Hello, Emilio.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you for coming. How are you?
I'm okay. It's my first time in a proper studio.
Ooh, it is a proper studio though.
It's a learning
this as
experience
well.
for me.
Oh, I'm excited. Well, this is my second time, so...
More experience than me. Yeah, good.
Amazing. So I guess we're here today to discuss your work in systems theory, sociomateriality, and the ethics-based framework of autonomics to examine businesses' role in systems change. So I just said quite a lot there, quite a lot of big words as well. Can you explain in layman's terms exactly what I just said and what you do?
Yeah. So when we talk about systems theory, it is the kind of nuanced complexities of how our wider systems work together. I look at a particular type of systems theory, which is called a second-order cybernetics theory of systems.
Can you?
The idea here being is that these systems are self-replicating, and the role of us as individuals, as people, is that interestingly enough, we form the environment of the systems rather than the systems themselves. And so we interact with these systems in a bunch of different ways. And the notion of autonomics, it is an ethics-based framework, but it basically demarcates different levels of societal interaction, and it really emphasizes the interconnection or the interrelation between kind of ideas, rules, so institutions, and how we actually interact with one another. And it kind of stratifies them into three different levels. So if you think about like a game like football, autonomics has what they call the basic game. They have the metagame, and then they have the meta-metagame, which is at the highest level.
Right.
So if you think about the basic game as us actually playing football in an arena, the moves we make, etc., they're constrained by rules, right? So for example, you can't have 15 people on one side of the field at one time. You have to... there is the offsides rule, and that is at the metagame. This is where these institutions, these rules of the game kind of operate. And then you have the meta-metagame, which is the highest level, which is basically how we, as a collective or as society, we determine what rules are most appropriate. So rules change. With the offsides rule in football, for example, it didn't always exist. We kind of decided that this would make the game more, let's say, fun. It would make it more competitive. Putting, for example, caps on trades is a relatively arbitrary rule, an arbitrary institution. And so autonomics looks at the ways in which we can, as people, make these different changes.
Okay, that
so
clarifies things loads. Thank you so much. I guess before we get into your research and your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? So you grew up in Brooklyn, in New York, and I'm sure you've seen Brooklyn and the whole of New York changed so much. How was it growing up in Brooklyn, and how did growing up there impact your career?
Yeah, so this career, I kind of fell into it, right? So I had always known that I wanted to do a PhD at some point in my life. I didn't have academic as like a career choice. So I think growing up in Brooklyn, seeing the changing face of the city, seeing how different communities are being invested in while others are not, seeing, for example, new people move in. I went home a couple of years ago, and New York is completely different than what I remember. I think it influenced my research interests more than my career. So I think seeing the changing city, seeing how things, develop in some areas and not, I think it influenced my research interest more than my career itself. And then the career was more serendipitous. It was something that I just kind of fell into. I've seen a lot of, for example, like bodegas and food stores close and be turned into apartment buildings or real estate agencies. I think one impactful thing that I think about, because it was when I was in high school, was the creation of the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, so the home of the Nets on Atlantic Avenue. Because the Barclays Center drew on what's called eminent domain quite heavily. So eminent domain is a mechanism by which the government can kind of take private property or assets for public use. And while the property owners are compensated, it tends to be a kind of like low ball figure. The area is really not, I think, much better than it would have been if it was, if it had developed more organically or from the ground up. And, there's supposed to be like affordable housing complexes that I don't think ever materialized. So this sort of urban development or these urban projects where it rhetorically benefits the local communities, but in practice it doesn't really benefit the local communities, is something that, interested me to pursue this research phenomena, so urban development. I remember when I was younger, I used to see a lot of like graffiti on the streets of people saying, for example, like, we don't need more apartments, we need grocery stores and things like that.
Oh, wow, interesting.
So I think it's just really, it drove my interest in urban development. And I think that's kind of what set me on this path.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, like when you talk about that side of gentrification, because I know from being in London how you see these huge high-rise apartment flats go up, and it's like luxury flats and affordable homes. And then when you look, it's like affordable homes, £800,000. I'm like, no, not affordable homes. Who can afford this? So I feel like, is that a similar thing that's happening in Brooklyn and in New York as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question, I think, becomes in many instances, in all major cities as well, the question becomes like, affordable for who? Mm-hmm. And we have instances, I think, where cities try to be competitive on like a global scale, where municipalities want people to move to their cities. And there's an expectation where I think an influx of money can uplift a particular area, but then it becomes unaffordable for those people who actually live there. So the question, as I said, really becomes, okay, affordable, but affordable for who? And I think that's a wider housing market situation.
Yeah.
That is in New York. It is also in London, but it's in a lot of big cities around the world. And I think gentrification gets a very bad rap. Or let me not say bad rap. I think it's identified as the cause, but I don't think it's the cause. I think it's a symptom of something bigger.
What, in your opinion, what do you think is the symptom of something bigger?
I think gentrification is a symptom of how we value communities and how we value, let's say, or what we think is value, right? So I think a neighborhood developing, I think, is good for the people that live there. I think what's not good for the people that live there is when the people that live there have to leave.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you were lucky enough to own a property, or if you were in the situation where you own a property and your property value increases, if you choose to sell it and then go wherever, that's your prerogative, and good for you, well done. But it's those instances where people have to leave because they can't afford it anymore, because prices are being pushed up higher, that becomes an issue. And I think that is a symptom of over-reliance on an influx of, let's say outside money or outside competencies or outside values. And what I mean by that is, instead of trying to attract a bunch of people from, let's say, not even just abroad internationally, but in the case of New York, you have a lot of people coming from the Midwest, no shade, but you have a lot of people coming from the Midwest, and they are systematically replacing those people who grew up and live in New York. And I remember, maybe, how old am I? I remember maybe like 8 years ago, I was at home. I was at a bar with some friends. We all went to high school together, so we were all from Brooklyn. And a woman asked us where we were from, and we said we're from Brooklyn. And her reaction was like, wow, you guys are from here? And I remember thinking to myself, that is a weird reaction to have to somebody when you're in Brooklyn. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think it's very similar in London from what I've seen so far. I mean,
Yeah.
granted, I'm one of those people who's not from London.
Yeah, I'm a northerner, as you can tell. So yeah, I'm not.
But like I said, I think the problem is not gentrification per se. I think it's what gentrification represents. And I think what it represents is a disconnect between individual people's values and the value that maybe the municipality is placing on a certain area. Or I guess we could say the values embedded like within the wider system.
Yeah.
So that is where I think there's a kind of difference between the two.
Oh, that sounds great. I mean, I remember when I first moved to London, then my friends who were from London, I remember thinking, like speaking to them, and they would say like, oh, well, either they're going to have to rent forever or they have to stay with their parents until God knows when. And like my friends from back home, this was like 10 years ago when I first moved to London, they have the opportunity to buy their own properties, to stay in their local area. And I remember thinking, God, my friends here in London, it's going to be harder for them to like actually stay within the square mile of wherever they grew up because it's so expensive now. Yeah, I think gentrification is a very interesting one. So let's get into some of your research, and exactly what we can do as an urban society towards sustainability. Your PhD thesis focused on social entrepreneurship and focused on how social entrepreneurship can drive behaviour change for sustainability. What is the difference between entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship?
So the main difference, I think, is that social entrepreneurship has at its core, at its foundation, social improvement over profit. Now, you can be a responsible entrepreneur, so I'm not suggesting that if someone is kind of a traditional commercial, let's call it commercial entrepreneur, and they're in pursuit of profits, that you can't do anything, with those profits. But social entrepreneurship, I would say a difference is that they kind of exist, or they work within let's call it a game. They work within a game where the beneficiaries of what it is that they're doing generally cannot pay full market price for it. So we live in a world where we tend to base things on market value, right? And so if, let's say I am, just as an example, let's say I'm Apple and I'm selling a phone. If you want this phone, it's $1,000 or £1,000. So you're going to either buy the phone or you're not. And if you buy the phone for $1,000 or £1,000, this phone is worth £1,000, right? Based on kind of market value. The market is, I think, very efficient, but it is also not very fair at times. And the market is not very good, I think, at valuing social value. So, for example, if you are running a social enterprise and what you want to do is you want to deliver, let's say, education to underprivileged youth, right? The question then becomes what is that value? How is that value measured? And the market is not so hot at valuing that because these people the beneficiaries of this work, based on the nature of the work you're doing, generally cannot afford to pay what the market would say is the value of these things. And so there's a disconnect between the actual, value in social improvement that you're providing and what the market sees as that value. So what's interesting to me, and this is where my thesis came in, is because social entrepreneurs operate in, I think, a space where, I'm not saying it's harder, but they're operating against a system that doesn't value what they're doing as much or as explicitly as perhaps it should. They have to come up with kind of innovative and new ways in order to maintain viability. So economic viability in terms of they have to be able to sustain. And how do we demonstrate for, let's say, our funders, let's say if we want to apply for a grant, whatever it is, how do we demonstrate that what it is that we're doing has enough of a value that justifies, let's say, your investment? And so one of, I think, the big differences you can see between the two is how they kind of measure their impact. So generally speaking, with commercial entrepreneurs, you can measure your impact based on kind of like return on investment, the kind of profits, the revenue you generate. You can kind of, generally speaking, it's relatively straightforward. Whereas with social enterprises and social entrepreneurship, a lot of the metrics that one would use are kind of developments in the human condition or social impact benefits, or how many people have I been able to educate, or how many, let's just say, bits of clothes have I been able to provide to these people in need. Now, these people, generally speaking, these beneficiaries who might need these clothes, usually cannot afford to pay market price for these clothes. And so that's where we see the disconnect. And so social entrepreneurs, I think, and this is why I've chosen to study this, they have to be, I think, much more innovative in the way they communicate their value to a system that I think is moving in the right direction, but to a system that I think inherently off rip values it slightly less. And so I think it's a lot of work to just say, okay, this is what the value is. This is the change that I'm making. This is how, this is why we deserve to be kind of where we are. So I think that's kind of the difference between the two.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you meant, like, in your research, you talk about a lot about social innovation, stuff like that. What is social innovation?
So just to back up. So my thesis was basically, as you said, it was looking at the role of social entrepreneurship as a kind of societal tool to impact systems change. And in my thesis, it was within the context of smart cities and inclusive urban development. And I deliberately chose to talk about social entrepreneurship as a tool because everybody has the capacity to be an entrepreneur. Everybody has the capacity to be a social entrepreneur. And so social entrepreneurs and really any socially oriented individual, these are those people who can facilitate institutional change. And as I mentioned before, institutions are kind of those rules of the game, and these rules set the foundation for these structures or these systems that we're currently operating in. And from an autonomic perspective, these rules are not indelible. They can change. They're in many cases relatively arbitrary, so we can change that. And social innovation is kind of that point where we begin to see these shifts manifesting. And social innovation, generally speaking, I think follows these kind of three tenets. The first being it's about addressing needs that are overlooked by the market or the state. The second being that social innovation kind of facilitates these new institutional relations. And then the third being that it empowers people to actually make the change towards these structures and move towards systems change. So the thesis itself was kind of a very long academic way of saying that individuals, like, kind of one person or people on the micro level, have great capacity to influence massive systems-wide change. So
that's so good, and it's so refreshing as well, because I feel like you're here in so many different areas of anything. It's just like, oh, well, I'm just one person. How can I, especially with sustainability, how can I make a change? I'm just one person. And you're literally just explaining now to be like, yeah, you can make a change even if you're just one person.
Well, it's a massive problem with sustainability, I think, that, I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, no, I think the thing about social innovation, how it can be used to facilitate some level of systems change, is that at its core, I think it's the way people can change the rules of the game. It's about drawing on a kind of hybrid of existing elements, and we cross sectoral boundaries, and you're empowering these people to make, and by these people I mean really anyone, you're empowering people to engage with perhaps groups that they may not have engaged with before, and set the scene for further innovation. So not just necessarily social innovation, but innovation, full stop. Yeah. So yeah, I think what interests me with social innovation is that it is about empowering people who perhaps were not in the conversation before, or were underrepresented in the conversation before, or perhaps, if we have the table here, they're kind of like on the side, and you can say like, yeah, we listen to them, but do you really? So I think social innovation is a way of really trying to restructure how we go about, society.
That's amazing. So, do you have any actual examples, any real world examples of how social innovation has helped to create new, fairer systems? It's okay if you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of quintessential example is like with microfinance. So are you familiar with the Grameen Bank?
No.
Oh, so the Grameen Bank is so Mohammed Yunus is the founder of the Grameen Bank. He won a Nobel Peace Prize in economics we're being recorded, so I don't know I think 2006 is when I think he won this piece.
Some specific date.
Yeah, I think it was 2006. And basically what the Grameen Bank and microfinance did is it revolutionized the way people without the rural poor can get out of this poverty trap. So traditionally, the traditional banking system, right, was, if you're a bank and I need money, and I go to you and I say, hey, I need, $20,000 or 20,000 pounds, what would the first thing you say to me be?
How can you pay it back?
Yeah, exactly. So how can you pay it back, right? So banks operate on this understanding that they have to make money back, they have to be paid back. And so generally in the West, let's say, traditionally, you do that through collateral or a credit score, both of which represents your kind of willingness, ability, or, you're going to pay it back because that's what these banks want. Now, with the kind of rural poor, they didn't have collateral. Because of that, they were constantly being denied loans. And so they would go to, for example, loan sharks. Now, these loan sharks are people by definition who would give you a loan at like an exorbitant sum that you could never pay back, right? And so we had this poverty cycle. Now, what Muhammad Yunus did, which was amazing, is he identified that, okay, if you are living in a rural village and you don't have property, you don't have collateral, you don't have, you don't have really anything to guarantee you're going to pay it back. Well, what's the one thing that you do have? Well, you have, I guess in academic speak, social capital, but you have these connections with people in your village, your friends, your family, whatever it might be. And so they have now these credit rings, they call them, where 5 people of your choice, there's 4 of us here, let's say the 4 of us for now, would decide we were going to take out a loan, right? The 4 of us come together and we each kind of co-sign the loan. So we all want a loan, you get your loan first, and then I only start getting my loan when about 80% of yours is paid back. And then once yours is fully paid back, I get the rest of mine, then Faz would get some of hers, and then it would go forward, right? And so the idea here was that, okay, traditionally you have no capital, collateral. Traditionally, there's no way that we can ensure that you're going to pay back. But if you take a step back and you think about it, as a bank, I don't really have to trust you, right? I don't know you, it's fine. The mechanism of trust here is collateral. Now, with the Grameen Bank, what they identified is, all right, I don't know you, I don't trust you, but I do trust that you will not kind of screw them over, right? So you will pay back because of that. And so what it did is it scaled, and it's still going now. I think Grameen Bank has something like a 97% repayment rate.
Oh my God,
so
that's amazing.
This is kind of a good example, I think, of social innovation, because we are demonstrating now that a group who normally was removed from engaging with or participating with a bank and the institution of banks now has a way in, and it removes them from this poverty trap because we've been able to identify, I say we, because they at the Grameen Bank have been able to identify that there are fundamental, let's say rules of the game or principles wherein a bank or the lending situation has to work. And if one of those is trust, fine, the traditional mechanisms of trust, let's say credit score or collateral, is really not relevant here because we have an in-kind sort of collateral, and that is your closeness with, your family or your friends or the people that you live with. So it's kind of like a quintessential example.
That's
of social
amazing.
innovation.
That's such a good bank. And is that across the whole world, or is it just?
It is now. Yeah, it started in Bangladesh,
Ah,
and it's grown in significant scope now.
that's amazing. So, many of our current systems feel really outdated and quite stuck. How do you think that we can push for big changes that make society more socially and environmentally responsible?
Well, to be honest with you about my cynicism, I'm not sure that the systems are actually outdated per se.
Okay.
I think a lot of the systems are doing precisely what they are intended to do. I think there are vested interests in maintaining the systems as they are. Having said that, so change is hard. So some of these vested interests are not necessarily malicious. Some of them can be benign, and it makes sense because, as I said, change is hard. Some people are uncomfortable with change. Some people might have trepidation to change, and I think that makes sense. I think evidence of how the system is kind of working, societally speaking, is we do kind of like crazy cool things. I mean, AI and large language models, and we send people to space for fun, and we can sequester carbon in like volcanic rock. I think it's pretty cool, the things we do. I also think, though, that we now see that the system works for a very particular very particular group and under very particular circumstances. And I think the question then, and these systems are self-replicating, right? So unless there's a systematic and intentional movement towards trying to change them, I think they're going to keep serving the people that they do in the ways that they do. I think what it requires from us, kind of societally speaking, is interrogation of the vested interest, whether and interrogation of the legitimacy of those vested interests, whether they are malicious or whether they are benign, and then really seeing where we sit within that. So as an example, from the climate crisis, there's been a huge campaign for reducing our individual carbon footprints, right? I think, and it's important, individual recycling is a big thing that I think is being pushed, and recycling is super important. I can't stress that enough. I think you should recycle. I think everybody has a part to play and they should play it. We know that that's not the only way we can reduce our own individual carbon footprints. However, beyond petroleum, BP, I think played a very big role in that campaign for pushing individual recycling, which is a bit interesting. And I think the situation is that, like I said, I think it's semi-important. There's a role to play, but focusing on the individual, our individual actions, I think detracts from the role that others should play. So, for example, BP is pushing this as an example, and I think like 100 oil companies are the cause of like 70% of the carbon emissions, right? Yeah. So, and perhaps they're not doing what they need to be doing, right? So there's a disconnect, I think, between the gravity of the situation and the kind of steps that we're being told to make. So on one hand, I think it kind of placates, not to be a conspiracy theorist, I think it kind of is meant to placate us as individuals to say, yeah, look, we're doing our part, we are doing enough. But at the same time, because we think we're doing enough individually, we can kind of perhaps blame one another or say, look, we need to be doing this, and maybe shame each other and not looking at the kind of biggest emitters and the role they have to play. But at the same time, there are vested interests, not just from, clearly you can see them, I think, from the oil companies, but there are vested interests why individuals and why people might not be making the change they have to make, right? So, it requires self-reflection. Like, are we addicted to fossil fuels? Like, what would we have to, for example, forsake or give up, at least in the short term, to move towards renewable resources? Do we have to pay more in the short run before we use enough renewable resources where prices begin to come down? Do we have to kind of sacrifice some level of comfort while we make this transition? And as I said, it makes sense why people would be, I think, have a bit of trepidation in making those sacrifices, and there's legitimate reasons. And I think this requires interrogating these reasons and these vested interests. So if you know that riding a bike, for example, is better for the environment than driving a car, full stop, but you have carrying responsibilities, let's say, or you have to bring, a parent or family member, a child, wherever they have to go, you probably don't want to put them on the back of a bike, right? What if, for example, you don't have carrying responsibilities, but it takes you twice as long to get to work if you ride a bike? The question becomes then, where's the kind of onus for this change, right? Would it be your position as an employer to be like, all right, Emilio, look, it'll take you, if you're riding a bike, it takes you 2 extra hours. You can start at 10 instead of 9, so that it kind of incentivizes me a bit more to make this make this more responsible, environmentally responsible choice. So one question there becomes, okay, where does the change get made? Where does the onus kind of lie? And so like I said, I think it requires this interrogation, which itself requires kind of self-reflection. And I think we as society maybe are not doing that.
Yeah, I think it sounds like it's a bit of both, isn't it? So it's a little bit, I think, in my opinion, it's a lot more policy, systems changes, things like that. I mean, even with the recycling stuff, like I watched a documentary about like recycling and kind of plastics recycling specifically, and how like in the 70s, I can't remember the name of the documentary, so I'm not even going to attempt to. And it was talking about in the 70s how the US government were basically, there was a big petition to say there's so much pollution in the streets and stuff. And the US government said to the oil companies, the plastic companies, either you stop making this or you sort out this pollution problem. And then they said, well, we'll set up these recycling plants, but you guys, someone else has to run them. So it's almost like recycling has kind of like given a green light to continue making plastics in a way. But that was just like about these bigger things. But then I guess like in terms of our individual responsibilities, I think you're right. But it's like behavior change again, isn't it? And it's like finding the ease within how do we like reflect and change our own behavior, which I think like it's so difficult to do, to be like try and change the patterns, and even like waking up an hour earlier, like, which is like
I think so I think on one hand we have kind of kicking the can down the road in the sense in your plastic example where, look, we're gonna keep doing this, we'll set up something and you guys got to deal with it. I think a challenge is that it is very much from both ends. You know, we do have an individual role to play. Like we should try to make the change we want to see and all that good stuff. But that doesn't mean not recognizing that these large companies, these policies need to change. Like that is not to say we can't recognize that everyone, including them, have a very big role to play. And you know, you guys kind of output a lot, so maybe you should be doing a bit more.
Yeah.
So I think we need to do both. And so I teach I teach carbon literacy training with the Carbon Literacy Project. Shout them out, their charity. And one of the things I think the Carbon Literacy Project, and also I do when I kind of teach this, is it's trying to understand the complexities and the nuances of how these three pillars of sustainability, the economic, the social, and the environmental, actually come together to form a very complex web where it is not that simple, for example, to just say, look, recycle this and you'll be fine, or eat less meat and you'll be fine. Like, yeah, these are things and steps we can take, but there are wider ranging structural and systematic causes that kind of lead to why us making these changes would impact things on a higher level. So part of that is, I think it's so much more complex than so many people know, that sometimes if it's not communicated correctly, people think, well, okay, I don't want to be a vegan. I mean, you don't have to be a vegan, right? Like maybe have a bit less meat, you know? But it is your right to not be a vegan, right? No one's trying to make you be a vegan. So I think people get caught up in discussions that are actually not particularly relevant. So for example, recognizing that the meat kind of industrial complex is a big emitter it's not a slight on you, right? It's just, this is what it is. And so again, where's the onus? We need to interrogate why we're either not changing that, how we would change that, and maybe ease the transition. You know, like maybe have a little less meat. You don't have to stop cold turkey, no pun intended, but you know, like maybe just chill a bit. And so
it's funny because the episode before this one is about the animal industrial complex, and we interviewed Stacey Banwell, and we spoke about veganism and things like that. And 100%, like this was brought up in the conversation of like, you know, it's not about changing everything in one day. It's just like little bits, little behavior changes helps, and like really goes a long way. You mentioned before in our conversation about smart cities, and by 2050, it's estimated that cities will be home to 70% of the world's population. So first of all, can you explain a little bit about what a smart city is?
Yeah. So in addition to that, it's been kind of, the UN, I think, put out something saying that by 2050, it's like 600 cities will make up like 60% of the world's GDP. Wow. And that's like 2% of geographic space, you know, like of the world, that's something like 2% of the space of the world.
Oh my God.
So cities are, of course, being extremely important. Yes, there's massive kind of urbanization. Smart cities, the idea of a smart city, it's a kind of urban planning, let's say, objective, right? The idea of a smart city is, I think the kind of most appropriate definition is a smart city is an urban environment that accelerates sustainability transitions through the implementation of like digital solutions to whatever urban challenges a particular city is facing. And the idea is to enhance the quality of life for all of its residents. So it kind of builds off of these principles of equal access to like health, justice, and prosperity. So that's kind of the idea of a smart city. I don't personally think a smart city yet exists.
Okay.
There are quite a few smart city indices put out by IMD, IBM, Juniper, PwC. I'm sure Accenture has one, and a bunch of other organizations that rank cities based on their smartness, based on certain criteria that these organizations put out. And there are some cities that are ranked as doing pretty well in certain areas, but I don't think a particular smart city exists yet. And that's because, technically a smart city should be one, or whenever it exists, should be one where every resident has the opportunity to kind of live their best life, to put it bluntly. And it doesn't exist yet, right? The UN put out a report, I think in 2023, saying that across the world there's still something like 1 billion slum dwellers. So in cities. So in terms of our movement toward, like, our societal movement towards creating, smart cities, I think there's a significant amount that has to, a lot of work that still has to be done.
Yeah. What do you think the end game for a smart city looks like?
I think there is no end game per se, and I think it's because it is aspirational in a good way. Just like sustainability, I think is aspirational, right? We're never gonna, even if we get to net zero, we're not gonna be like, all right, we're sustainable, we're done, and then you just stop. I think everything needs to be aspirational. So I don't think there's an end game per se. I think the ideal scenario is a urban environment where, irrespective of where you live in the city, let's say London, for example, if you live south of the river, if you live north of the river, if you live in the east or in the west, whatever it is, you have equal opportunity to do what you do. So to have a job that you want, to be able to, work to live, not live to work, to be able to access safely,
healthcare,
anything you want to do. Yeah, have access to healthcare, have affordable transportation, have mobility structures where if someone is disabled or if the elderly have trouble walking, they can get to A to B in a relatively easy and safe way. So yeah, I don't know if it would be an end game, but I think that's a good I think that's a good position to be in, and then we kind of keep building forward, because obviously as time goes on and as things change, life changes, social interactions change, and a smart city, I think, should be an urban environment where it keeps pace with people's life, with what is important to people, how people, want to exist and live, irrespective of where they are within the city's, limits.
Yeah, I actually heard on the radio this morning a statistic that there's been some research, and they've seen that people who live in poorer areas are more likely to get cancer. So, and there's things being put into place to try and work on that. Do you think we're moving in the right direction for a smart city? Do you think it's generally as a world we are, or do you think there's certain areas that are doing a bit better?
I think there are areas that are doing a bit better. I think maybe we're taking tiny steps forward. I don't think those steps are kind of coming fast enough. And I think that's because of the current kind of systems that we're operating in, or rather the interpretation of the systems that we're operating in. So a lot of smart city projects, for example, tend to draw on what's called a kind of public partnership approach, very similar to the Barclays Center, where something is implemented and it's implemented in partnership between the municipality, wherever it might be, and some big company. It tends to be a tech company, right? And what we see there, and generally it's done to kind of split the cost, right? Municipalities are cash strapped, and sometimes implementing large projects, take time, and they also take money. And so these private organizations sometimes come in and they kind of fill that gap, and they fill the money. In many instances, that is a way to demonstrate the efficacy of that solution, whatever digital solution they choose to implement, so that they can export it to another city and say, look, it worked in London, so it'll work in, Amsterdam, it'll work in New York, it'll work in Mumbai, whatever. that is an issue that I could touch on in a second, because these are not copy and paste issues, right? Like cities are all different. Cities have a heartbeat. There's something special about them. And so copy and paste just won't work. But what happens is that there are a company has a vested interest. If it's investing X amount of money, it has some vested interest. And so the question becomes, what is the difference between their interests and the interests of the people who actually live there? And are the interests of the people that actually live there, are they being taken into account? Now, as I said, in the kind of system that we're operating in, there is rationale, or it makes sense why, if you're putting in the money, you have a louder voice, And so I think this tendency to practice these smart cities in this way significantly diminishes the kind of holistic benefits of a smart city. So from my perspective, we are not moving in the right direction quickly enough, but we are making baby steps, which I guess is kind of nice, because at least we're moving sort of forward. Yeah. And there are local initiatives, local organizations that are doing a lot of good work and trying to hold these sorts of things to account. I mean, there was I don't know if you're familiar with Sidewalk Labs in Toronto.
No.
So this was a smart city initiative with what is it called? Alphabet, so Google's parent company. Yeah. And the idea was to make a kind of new neighborhood. And there was a whole kind of debacle because they didn't go through the kind of proper, let's call them, no shade, let's say perhaps not the proper democratic processes by which people actually had a say in how their data would be used. And so ultimately the project, was scrapped. Right. So we do see a tendency for kind of communities and residents to say, look, no, these things need to work for us. And I think that's a good sign.
That's good.
I think it should happen more often than it does, but I think it's a good sign.
Okay, so the way that we design and build cities can either strengthen or it can weaken equity and fairness within society. How do you think urban development can be used to create more fairer and connected communities?
I think so spatiality, plays a big role in urban development. There are geographically affluent areas, right? And then there are geographically deprived areas. And the question is, of course, why? So we know that some areas attract investment and others do not. Again, the question is why? I think, we see it all over the world, and I'm sure you've seen it in London. I think an interesting thing to look at as, I guess, maybe like a proxy is, like in London, the access to public transportation. So we know, for example, like south of the river, there's significantly less tube stops.
I live south of the river now, but I used to live north, and I'm like, what? I have to get a bus everywhere now.
Yeah, going from A to B in the south, at least on the train, is significantly more tedious than in the north. And the question becomes why? We know that there's more train tube stops in areas that are, let's say, valued more for one reason or another. I think a prime example is like the Waterloo and City Line, which has like one stop from Waterloo to Bank. So, and we can, again, not to be a conspiracy theorist, and it's rational based on this system that I was talking about before and how we're currently playing this game. It seems that the Waterloo and City Line is purposely to facilitate movement for those operating in the kind of financial district. Yeah. And so the question, I think, for urban development is, what do we value and who has value? So why do we value certain areas more than others? What is the return on the investment that we are trying to get out of investment in these areas? And I think from a social justice and a social equity perspective, we know that everyone has some value, right? And a lot of the times it's unlocking what that is. But everybody should have the opportunity to kind of capitalize and leverage on that value to do whatever it is they want to do. And so I think from an urban development perspective, that requires investing in traditionally underserved and underinvested areas, or areas that have not been at the table when discussions have been had about what we should invest in. And so I think one of the ways we can do that, or governments can do that, or policy can do that, is ensuring people have the tools and the structures to be their best selves where they are. So, schools, sports facilities, supporting local organizations, whether they're, community interest organizations, supporting local entrepreneurs or local social entrepreneurs, whatever it might be, but giving these people the ability to be their best selves where they are, I think needs to be central to urban development. So there's a really interesting, really fantastic organization who I want to give a shout out to. It's called Urban Rise. Mm-hmm. The founder is actually, I don't know if you know them, the founder is actually a graduate from the University of Greenwich.
No way.
Ahmed. And he does amazing work with developing financial literacy. And I think this is the exact type of initiatives that have to be at the center of kind of human-centered urban development. And that's how we can kind of regenerate communities and ensure people have the skills they need where they are. So as an example, with Urban Rise, teaching financial literacy, policy or local municipalities or even private organizations that want to participate in, community regeneration without holding this community hostage, they can, for example, provide Urban Rise with a space so they can deliver financial literacy at scale, and give people the tools to actually play the game we're playing. In this case, it's money and wisely using your money and how to make decisions when our incomes are limited. But this is the exact kind of thing that has to be at the center of urban development and community regeneration. So I think is a long way of me answering your question. I think in order for us to leverage or use urban development in the right way, we have to be very intentional on what we value, what returns we want on whatever investments we're inputting, and also be willing to not be too myopic in terms of the time span it takes. So, for example, if you want an underserved community that has historically not been invested in to build up, you can't give it a year or 2 years and say, look, if they haven't done it, it's been a failure, right? It has to be longer. And I think in the game that we're currently playing, I think there's a aversion to looking in the long term unless the long term brings like a shit ton of money. Yeah. And I think that needs to be tweaked. I think we need to not think that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's how we can use urban development to be a bit more socially just.
That's great. We are a sustainability podcast, but we also look into how creativity and sustainability work together and intersect, and how the two can, I guess how creativity can help sustainability and make a better future for our planet. So off the back of that, are there any films or podcasts or pieces of art or musicians or artists that have either inspired you or that are kind of to do with your research, or things that you think people should go and watch?
I think off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. I think the answer is probably yes. I think that's the power of like art and definitely of things like culture, where it can influence you in a way that perhaps is sometimes hard to identify or articulate. So I'm sure the answer is yeah. I mean, you know what I'm a big fan of? I'm a big fan of Parks and Recreations. Okay. Big fan of Parks and Recreations. If you haven't seen it, highly recommend it. Yeah. I think the thing that I like, I think it's hilarious, but I think the thing that does speak to me is the kind of one of the protagonists. She is someone who is trying to make her town a better place. I think it's an interesting perspective on small town politics. I think it is an interesting perspective on how individuals can navigate the kind of, institutional frameworks and the bureaucracy. And I think what is interesting about it is it demonstrates how one person can make a change. So I guess maybe that's influential. Parks and Rec. Parks and Rec. I used to do a lot of volunteer work, and I used to see myself sometimes when I would watch Parks. I've watched Parks and Recreations like 87 times, but I would sometimes think, okay, yeah, there are hiccups, there are challenges, and like don't let it get you down.
You were like in the TV show.
Yeah, fully. You know what I mean? Like so, totally recommend it. It's not really about. I guess it is about sustainability in the sense that, social sustainability and economic sustainability, because, for example, that's, what my research is on. So things like resource efficiency, innovation, adaptation, social justice, community resilience.
And this is all interconnected as well.
Oh,
like
100%.
It's like solving the human crisis is solving the climate crisis.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I might argue that it's that we are we are the problem.
Yeah. Well, actually, I make that statement because when I was in Borneo, I was speaking to a local guy there, and I was like, "What's going on with all this palm oil?" Blah blah blah, asking about that, and I was like, "Is it all these big corporations?" And he was like, "Well, yeah, part of it." And he said, "Some of these that you've seen around here are local people." They're just local farms, and they've removed the other things that they're growing, and they've put palm oil there. And I was like, well, why? And he said, because they make more money from palm oil. And he said, if they grow the other things, yeah, they can feed their family and they can, do all the basics. But he said, if they grow palm oil, they can put their kids in school and they can just go that extra step. And I was like, wow, okay. So if you had schools here, and I saw like a really interesting initiative, and it was like a school where they didn't pay, they brought a tree sapling, and so if you had schools there, then perhaps you could then use that land not for palm oil, you could use it for other things, and that's what made me think like, oh, solving the human crisis is part of solving the climate crisis. But I
mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think, like I said, I think our values are perhaps not conducive to the health of the planet.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we have to, for example, completely abandon our values. Like I use, an iPhone, and iPhones have lithium batteries. I also vape, and unfortunately it's reusable, but it also has a lithium battery.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that I am not above reproach, but I do think that we have these values collectively that systematically I think we can make slight tweaks to. I mean, in when I do carbon literacy, one of the things I tell the students, like the concept of pretty privilege. So pretty privilege exists in the context of fruits and vegetables, right? So some people, for whatever reason, don't want to eat an ugly, fruit or an ugly vegetable, even though it's absolutely perfect. It'll chop it up, eat it, whatever. It's the same. And what we do, or what that does, is that incentivizes waste in the supply chain, right? So if you're a farmer and you have your yield, and this is hyperbole, but let's say 50% of it is ugly, then there's an incentive for you to either like throw it out or do something else with it, because if you send it to, for example, Tesco, a lot of it's not going to be bought because it's ugly, right? So this is incentivizing waste within the supply chain. And so I think, just as you had mentioned with, individuals growing palm oil because they make more money, I think it is a bit of this human condition where our values are a bit not perhaps aligned with what they should be. And to be honest, I'm pretty sure if there's a collective effort, an intentional effort, I think a lot of them can be switched. Like I think a lot of them are habitual. I think a lot of our values are more habitual than actual values, if that makes sense. I think a lot of it is just
I completely
ingrained
agree with
habits.
You. Yeah.
So I think these things can change, but how do we incentivize it? That's, I think, the issue. And
Right.
I think part of it is us understanding our place in this wider system, understanding its complexity, understanding, like I said, these vested interests and where we stand. And some of it is like, look, it's kind of your fault, bro. Like, but it's okay, it's okay. Like, it's your fault. That's fine. It's my fault too. What do we do now? Like, we're both in the maze together. Let's find the cheese. Like, that's what we need to do. And I think people are perhaps not. I think some people take it as kind of an ad hominem attack, right? And I think some people find it different to kind of parse the nuances of, look, it's your fault, it's my fault, and that's fine. But like, let's just kind of sort this together. So.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our conversation. It's gone so quickly.
It has.
So this is a question we're going to ask all of our guests. It's basically that I feel like the average person, there's so much doom and gloom in the world. You see it all on the news. You see, you hear it in conversations. And I feel like the average person can very easily give you a negative view of what the future will look like. More fires, water scarcity, that sort of thing. But I feel like what we need to do is kind of develop this positive vision for the future, to be like, you know, in the 80s it was like, oh, people are going to be on flying cars and things like that. I mean, obviously that's not happened, but like have this positive vision of the future. So what does a positive or hopeful 2050 look like to you?
2050. Well, I'm not exactly sure, but in my 2050, there are things like 4-day work weeks.
Yes.
I think in my 2050, we collectively, societally, have the ability to, I think, coalesce around legitimate solutions. And like we have at least some, I mean, I'm not here to tell someone what they should value, right? That's a bit kind of extra, so that's not what I'm doing, or that's not what I'm trying to do. But I think we can collectively coalesce around values that provide, let's say, solutions to some of these crises. I think we have demonstrated that we have significant capacity to sort problems. I think our problem is that we wait until the last minute to try to sort them. So I think in my
That's also my personal problem, actually.
No, me too. No, me too. You're not alone. So I actually think in my 2050, I actually think we have come up with a lot of solutions for some of the problems that we're facing now. I think a problem is that a lot of people can kind of look at, I think there's this like psychological distance between some of these issues where, yes, the climate crisis is real. Yes, there's a serious problem. And if you keep hearing people say like, let's just say by 2050, we're all screwed, some people can say, okay, well, that's 2050. This is now, we're going to be good, right? I think in my 2050, I think a lot of our problems can be sorted, but we need a collective effort. So I think in my 2050, things like, and the reason I say things like 4-day work week is because if you kind of, like you said, if you sort the kind of human condition problem, then I think we can sort a lot of the climate problem. But I really do think it starts with how people can live their lives and can leverage and express the value that they have to potentially come up with solutions to the problem that we have. Things like, for example, the farmer doesn't need to only grow palm oil now because we're not going to pay that much for palm oil. So why don't we plant something that's a bit better for, let's say, biodiversity regeneration or something like that? Let's begin to start planting things that, help carbon sequestration. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but
No,
I think my
does.
2050, I think looks a bit brighter because I think we will have been able to hopefully coalesce around some of these challenges by collective effort. And I think if we make an intentional effort to do that, kind of the systems and the games that we're currently operating on, I think they can change. I mean, like I said, a lot of these kind of institutions and these underlying rules, they're relatively arbitrary. Like they can be changed, and we just need to like want to change them. But I think part of that is also a lot of people don't understand perhaps where they come from. So,
Well,
I think my 2050 is not so bleak.
That sounds great. No, I think that's a perfect way to end the conversation. And thank you so much, Emilio, for coming to speak to me. And this has been so insightful. I've learned a lot from our conversation today, and I hope these systems get sorted. And good luck with. Have you got any research that you're working on in the now or?
Yeah, I'm working on a few. Yeah, I have a couple of papers looking at the ways in which social entrepreneurs use space as a mechanism of communication. So communicating their social value. Because as I mentioned, sometimes it's hard to communicate why things are important. So I'm working on a paper on how social entrepreneurs use space.
Amazing. Well, good luck with it. Thank you once again. And thank you guys for listening to our episode. Tune in 2 weeks' time. Bye. And that's a wrap for today's episode. This podcast is brought to you from the Creative Futures Research Centre and the Sustainability Development Unit at the University of Greenwich. So, from all of us here, see you next time.